2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Power of Music Thinking. My name is Christoph Zirn, and this is the podcast for people with a musical heart and a wicked job. We're looking for stories, insights and tools from the big world of music to inspire leaders and followers to listen, tune, play and perform in whatever field you're operating.
What is the relationship between art-based learning, innovation, and co-creation? How do you lead an ensemble of leaders? And why do people often use the metaphor of a conductor when discussing leadership? Isn't a conductor actually just something like a middle manager? So, today we are in New York and talking with Harvey Seifter. Harvey is the founder of the Art of Science Learning, a U.S. National Science Foundation-funded initiative that uses the arts to spark innovation in science, technology, engineering, and education. And Harvey is also a classical trained musician and formerly served as executive director of the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, the only orchestra in the world that rehearses and performs without a conductor. Harvey shares with us insights on giving directions as a decision maker of last resort, as he calls it, stimulating co-creation and what this means for the innovative power of the organization. Well, you can say we have learnings here for any organization. And by the way, we recorded this episode via Zoom when Harvey returned just a few days from his TED Talk in Madrid. Before the talk, he lost his voice. And finally did the TED Talk without repetition. So, to spare his voice and energy, we stopped the recording at a certain point and agreed to have a second conversation in the very near future. So, listen to part 1 with Harvey Seifter and how you lead an orchestra of leaders.
Welcome, Harvey. Welcome to the Power of Music Thinking.
Great to be here, Christoph.
Well, Harvey, in the Power of Music Thinking, I always start with one question. It's like a ritual. It's always the same question, and it goes like this. What was your first sonic experience or album or live performance that had an impact on you?
Okay, that's a great question. So the first that I can remember that had a real impact on me was music at home. So it was my mother playing the piano. She actually taught me the basic notes of the piano when I was so young that I don't remember a time when I didn't know them, and taught me to connect those with the symbols on the page. So again, there was not a time when I can remember that I didn't know how to read music and wasn't used to listening to it. It was just kind of was in the air that we breathed, and it obviously had a lifelong impact on me.
Do you mean you first read music before you read a book, for example?
Yes. I learned to read music before I learned to read English.
Wow,
that's my first language. I can actually remember the moment where I first began to connect letters to words. I was with my dad, actually, and I was watching him read a newspaper, and which I used to do. I used to sit next to him, and I would sort of hold a paper, I guess, sort of like he had. And I was already picking out letters, but I remember when suddenly the idea that letters came together for words started to mean something to me, and where I started to say things. But by that time, I was already reading music. I don't remember a time when I didn't read music.
Wow. And was it piano music? So you read from the piano score?
Yes, that was the first read. My sister, who's more than 5 years older than me, is a pianist and was already a pretty accomplished one and played a great deal. So piano was her instrument. I kind of quickly moved from the basics of picking out notes on a keyboard to violin, which was my instrument. But first it was piano, actually.
Yeah, interesting. Because I always, when you think about a musical score, it's actually more an instruction than just something to read, which is interesting as an analogy to. So both is reading, but one is reading for doing, and the other one is reading for, maybe it's also for doing, but also for imagination, for anything else.
Yes, the idea of reading music as an imaginative, pleasurable kind of experience that reveals its own kind of nuances and insights, that came to me much later. That came to me with orchestral scores. And I found at that time, and I still to this day find that I can derive an awful lot of pleasure from just reading an orchestral score.
Yeah.
But that's very different than the instructional nature of, okay, so that's that note and that's how long you play it and that kind of thing.
Oh, I can tell you an anecdote about this. Just pops in my mind. When I was studying, I also worked in a music store, and I worked in the department of musical scores. And you might know the composer Wolfgang Riem. So a German composer, and he came there and bought books with his little daughter. And the little daughter said, "Oh, Papa, why do you need these books?" And it was all orchestral score, so these yellow
Yes.
pocket books. And I said, when I'm in the train, so I have something to read.
That's wonderful.
And so I thought, okay, so it's also like pure pleasure, pure, and very nice. Well, thank you for sharing. And we know each other since a few months, I would say, and we have quite some online meetings together. But can you please share who you are and what you do for a living?
Sure. So who am I? Well, let's see. Somebody whose first language is music, but my first instrument was violin, and then I kind of migrated from violin to conducting, and that was a real passion of mine. In college, I started hanging out with a rougher crowd, so I began to do theater, and theater was just a passion of mine. It was something that I really loved. I also really loved the social aspects of it. There were great parties. There were really interesting engagements with audiences, things that to this day remain much a part of my life. So my career revolved pretty much entirely around making music and making theater. In terms of music, I was conducting orchestras, in a student way and in a small scale professional way. I went from that to real passion for conducting operas, and from operas to musical, and that was my bridge into theater. Theater, I began to work professionally in New York in my 20s. Even before that, in Boston after school, I was really interested, had a passion for German experimental theater and expressionist theater from the early 20th century, and of course, American contemporary avant-garde and experimental theater. I became involved with a company in New York called Theater for the New City, Theater for the New City being one of the real founding generation of off-Broadway theaters in New York. It was then a 3-theater complex in the East Village, and we did somewhere around 50 shows a year. All of them were new, all of them were experimental. It was a 3-ring circus, quite literally. And we did everything from very solo performance art to huge ensemble pieces to street theater that we took to all 5 boroughs of New York and performed with a cast of dozens. So all different kinds of work. And I stayed with Theater for the New City for 7 years. I became eventually its executive director. So I produced during my time there about 450 new American plays. Some of them became very well known. Some of them won, Obie Awards and Drama Desk Awards and those kinds of things. Many of them didn't become known at all, but they were just really exciting and outstanding work. And also, did quite a lot of European work during that period too. So, for example, brought the German playwright Heiner Müller, his work to the United States for the first time in our production of Hamlet Machine.
Hamlet Machine, and that's nice. So it's also like, do you know Der Mann im Fahrstuhl, the man in the elevator?
Yes. So that was one. The German writer Kreutz did a lot of his work for the first time in the States. So that was an important element. Also we had Dario Fo in residence. We did his work. So which fit in wonderfully with the political and the circus-like street aspects of our work in theater for the city. So I did all of this work, and eventually was invited to go out to the West Coast. Well, before I did that, New York in the 80s was a kind of an interesting place, and the East Village was in many ways the epicenter of the artistic ferment of New York during those years. And there was a real estate revolution going on, which was changing the composition of the East Village very much. So the East Village has a theater tradition which actually went back at that time 100 years, because Second Avenue, the main street of the East Village, was actually the Broadway of the Yiddish stage in New York in the late 1800s. Oh. And so when I say the Broadway of the Yiddish stage, what I mean is that the parents and the grandparents, many of the founders we think of American theater, like Stella Adler, her father, Jacob Adler, played Lear in Yiddish on the Broadway of the Yiddish stage, Second Avenue, these grand houses. So there was all this theater tradition in that neighborhood, and the neighborhood had changed over the generations, and so there were different ethnic groups and cultures that were represented there. But it was always a place where people came, and people came from all over and were expressing themselves and were experimenting. And among other things, it was fueled by cheap real estate, because you could actually live there and you could try things, and you didn't have to spend all of your time raising the money to pay the landlord. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, that began to change. And what happened was we had this theater complex where we did these 50 shows a year. I should say that at the time, we used to charge $3 a ticket, which even then was just unheard of. As a matter of fact, I remember that when Reagan became president and tried to cut the National Endowment for the Arts, we raised the price from $3 to $4. We called it the Reagan surcharge. So this is how we lived. And then suddenly the landlord came in one day and said, okay, we're going to raise your rent 600%. This isn't for you anymore. Goodbye. So that led us in a saga that went on for several years, where we actually went all over the neighborhood and we found another place. And what we found was an old market building that had been built by the WPA to house pushcarts and peddlers that used to clog that neighborhood. And wasn't being used for anything except the New York Department of Sanitation was using it to warehouse and print bureaucratic forms. It was like a Kafkaesque fantasy land. All these forms that say no parking Tuesday, trash collection, they're all piled, billions all over this warehouse, this prime, fantastic building in the middle of the East Village. And of course, the guys on the side, they were also renting out parking spaces, which were at a premium, and making a little something out.
So, wow, that's highly creative, and also highly creative in finding your space, creating your space.
Yeah. So we led a community movement which went on for a couple of years. We ended up rallying thousands of people. We got the mayor involved. We got Joe Patton from the Public Theater involved. We helped out. It became a big cause. And eventually we were able to buy our own building and move. We formed a human brigade line and moved all of our stuff from the old place to the new place hand to hand. It took all day, and there we were. And so at that point, I got an offer to go out to California to become the artistic director of a really important theater out there. And I decided this was a good time for a change. So I went to the Magic Theater in San Francisco and continued to expand on my work with new and experimental theater. While there, one of our plays won the Kennedy Center Award, and we were becoming increasingly known for some important work. And eventually, I just missed New York too much. I came back home to New York, and I met my wife. We got married. Marge got pregnant with our daughter, and I figured, okay, maybe it's time to stop some of the theater stuff and get a job, so that things can be calm and good, and it's a good environment. So that's actually what yanked me by the collar and brought me back to music. So I came back to music. I was invited to become the director of the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra.
Wow. So did you play violin also during your theater days, or was this just, let's say, a box somewhere in the corner?
It was in the corner, and it was too far gone for me to be able to play violin with Orpheus. I couldn't play at that level anymore.
Right.
And so I took the job as executive director, but not as a member, as a performing musician with the orchestra.
Yeah,
so what that meant,
for the listener, I think we should share who the Orpheus, I would say the famous Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, what it is and who they are, and also what it means to be a director there.
Yeah. So Orpheus is, first and foremost, it's an astoundingly wonderful orchestra. It's just a really extraordinary ensemble, created back in the 70s by a core group of musicians, most of whom had come out of Juilliard and Columbia, and were all against the war, and many of them were performing together in a group called Musicians Against the War. And in that environment, they decided, there was a lot of questioning going on at that time about all kinds of things about leadership, different generation. They said, what if we just get rid of the conductor? What if we do this without a conductor? And of course, it's not like there were no models ever of orchestras without a conductor. There were some experiments in the Soviet Union in the 20s. There are certain types of period ensembles that work without a conductor. But somehow this was a little bit different in several ways. First, they decided that they were going to work on the chamber music principle. So this would not be a conductorless orchestra where, nevertheless, the concertmaster would be the quasi-conductor. And would beat the time and make the decisions and so on and so forth.
Like you had in Baroque, where sometimes the conductor was sitting behind the piano, and when he was not on the keys, he was sometimes giving accents or cues to keep it going, or together with
trying to keep his staff out of the way of his foot, like Lily.
Right.
But this was a little bit different. The idea here was to take the model and the ideal of chamber music and bring it to the orchestral repertoire. So the idea is that there would not be one leader, that this would be an orchestra of leaders, where everybody would lead sometimes, which of course also meant that everybody would follow sometimes, and that you need to develop some rules of the road so that could actually work in a practical sense. So the orchestra began experimenting with that in the 70s, and almost immediately the musicians were extraordinarily talented and gifted musicians. They were also passionately committed to the work and deeply engaged by this kind of music making. The results were wonderful, and they were really powerful. So within a few years of its founding, Orpheus found a home in Carnegie Hall. They found their way to global recording contracts with Deutsche Grammophon and others, and the orchestra began to be known as one of the world's great ensembles. When I came to Orpheus had been doing this now for 25 years. And so its ways of working were well established. In the early days, it was very difficult because since there weren't a lot of rules of the road, how do you do this conductorless thing? Well, make it work. How do you make it work in performance? How do you make it work in rehearsal? How do you make it work at the human level? The orchestra would play brilliantly, but sometimes you would have to rehearse for weeks just to be ready for one concert, because it was not what you would think of as an efficient process.
And maybe, Harvey, we also should share that this was classical music, and making the link with a score, it was exactly written out, like in times of Mozart, Beethoven, or in Beethoven, you also have the metronome numbers there. So it was some kind of exact thing that everybody know what to do. But how do you keep this together so that it's even maybe more extraordinary than all the other, let's say, the big conductors with their orchestra play? So what was the repertoire? So
the repertoire from the beginning was a very broad, eclectic repertoire. The only thing that limited it at the beginning was the size of the orchestra.
Yeah.
Initially, there were 26 musicians in Orpheus, and so it was meant to be a classical orchestra. The kind of orchestra you might have in a Mozart symphony, let's say.
Yeah.
And they had a few friends, so if they needed trumpet and drums, they could bring in trumpet and drums and that kind of thing. But it was a relatively compact kind of thing. Over the years, that expanded dramatically. During my time at Orpheus, the orchestra actually performed for the first time ever the Eroica Symphony at Carnegie Hall without a conductor. And that had actually not been done before, and it worked quite beautifully. And it further expanded from there. So in some work, the orchestra would grow to as many as 50 or 55 musicians. It seemed, from a practical standpoint, that once you get into double horns, so 4 horns or more, it gets more difficult to hold everybody together.
Right.
Not impossible, but more difficult. And so there are technical issues like that. But the repertoire ranged from Baroque all the way through 20th century, and of course to the 21st century music. The orchestra has a long tradition of commissioning new work and doing experimental stuff. There's been a fair amount of crossover work. During my years there, we did a wonderful recording with Branford Marsalis on jazz-influenced classics from early 20th century Paris. We did a recording which actually won a Grammy with Herbie Hancock. And so we did some crossover work, but the core of the repertoire of the orchestra was classical, romantic, and modern classical music in that sense.
Yeah, right. I saw the last work from Wayne Shorter, who died a few weeks ago. And I looked it up, say, okay, he also wrote a classical piece.
Yeah.
And then I said, oh, it's from Orpheus Chamber Orchestra.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And also I saw Ravi Shankar. There's also a symphony from Ravi Shankar.
Yeah.
That sounds also very special. So it also looks like, so if we look back how it came up, like from what you said, the musicians against the war, so doing something different. Yeah. Also, being everybody is not alone, only active playing, but more than playing. So there's maybe a bigger idea behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the really interesting things, you talk about the musical school. So generally speaking, in a symphony orchestra, you have, of course, the conductor is working from the full score, and the individual musicians have their parts. The music stands in front of them. The parts have been carefully marked by the principal of their section in coordination with the concertmaster, in coordination with whoever the music director of the orchestra is, perhaps the visiting conductor, who set the parts ahead the way that person wanted the bowings to go and the phrasings to go. So there was that kind of centralization and specialization and top-down approach, which was baked deeply into the culture of symphony orchestras over a couple of centuries. Mm-hmm. So Orpheus used the scores differently. Every musician worked from the full score.
Oh, wow.
Now, they also, of course, had their own part on the stand in front of them, so they visually not, be able to focus. But each musician was working from the full score. So everybody understood what their own role was in relationship to a complex whole. And that empowered them to think and feel and act and contribute and suggest and argue for their point of view about how they can best support this whole and what this whole ought to be. That's a profound change.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, and also so different to the tradition, and maybe good to because in the power of music thinking, we also talk about music, but also about anything else. For example, business.
Yes.
And that, that's why I also never use music as a metaphor just to get an idea across. It's much more an analogy. And if everybody has listened to what you just said with, let's say, with a business and a leadership ear, he or she would understand from, hey, wait a minute, there's something that they're doing differently, and that is actually, you could say, pretty modern. And in now these days, we have a lot of buzzwords for this. And it's not a completely coincidence that the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra did not just play music, but also did something else, right?
Yes. Well, I would take it a step further and say it's not only a question of, it's not just metaphor, but even beyond analogy. There are concrete, specific, in some cases cultural, in some cases technical learnings that you can derive from the experience of Orpheus and how it does its work that have these really powerful applications in lots of other environments. For example, it's clear from the work with Orpheus, it's also clear from the work of any really great ensemble. I don't care if it's a chamber group, it's a jazz ensemble, if it's a theater ensemble.
Yeah.
It rests on a foundation, trust, and mutual respect among the people that are doing this. If you don't have those things, it simply doesn't work. If those things don't exist, the rest of it won't happen. So what are the things that actually help inculcate and develop a culture characterized by trust and mutual respect? And it's actually possible. You can look then at Orpheus and at other ensembles as case studies, and you can distill out of how they do what they do, what makes it possible for them to operate with trust and mutual respect. And you can take that and you can actually apply that in a business setting or other kinds of settings. So there's lots to be learned from that. For example, one of the things, if you're going to be working from the full score, as well as from your part, one of the things that you need is a group of people who know how to do two very different things. They know how to be specialists. So in that sense, if you think about it, the musicians of Orpheus, the greatness of the orchestra rested to a significant degree on the fact that each one of those individuals were among the great musician performers of their instrument of their time. That viola section or whatever. So there was that ability to be a specialist, and that ability, of course, is reinforced by constant practice and study and extreme self-criticism and iteration and everything that goes with that. That is a necessary condition. Necessary but not sufficient. You also have to be a generalist. You also have to be able to actually look at that entire score and say, yes, I'm a violist, and as a violist, I know that my line is the most important thing on earth. And that's what I'm there for. And so, of course, and yet I'm also a generalist. I can look at the whole picture and I can understand what that means and how I might contribute to it and how that might be and how that evolves. And so the ability to integrate those two things, to balance. So that implies that you recruit for that. In Orpheus, it was very hard to get into Orpheus. I used to say that there was more turnover in the College of Cardinals than there was in the actual core membership of Orpheus, because auditions would go on for decades. Because you could play with the orchestra, yes, but to actually be accepted as a member, you had to really prove that you could do those two things, that you could be one of the great musicians in the world on your instrument, and you could be a great ensemble player who understood and could integrate and balance all these other things. And you had to prove it by actually doing it under very complex and challenging and demanding situations. So all of these cultural learnings that you can derive, really what it became clear to me during my time with Orpheus is that the world was moving in those years. I came to Orpheus in the late 90s. And so my time there really spanned the beginning of the rise of what came to be known as the flat organization. The whole idea was pretty simple. The IT revolution had just come far enough where it was beginning to completely smash out layers of middle management, who traditionally had done all kinds of middle person functions, and had instead, through efficiencies that were made possible and necessary by technology and speed, instead it pushed the responsibility down into the hands of the people who were actually doing the work, making the products, and in this case, making the music. In this case, the conductor was the middle person and was simply being removed. And it occurred to me that we had what you're calling an analogy, and I agree it is an analogy, but beyond an analogy, you had maybe a set of operating principles for how do you form that kind of an organization? How do you support it? How do you sustain it? How do you make it work in practical terms? And it occurred to me that the things that Orpheus had learned and mastered were things that had incredible amounts to teach across a wide and increasing range of human endeavors, many of whom have little obvious connection with music, conductorless orchestras. Right. And so we began experimenting. So the other thing that's maybe worth talking about for a minute or two is the relationship. Well, so what did I do? What was the role of the director of an orchestra that works without a conductor? So the answer is actually pretty simple, but it's also a little paradoxical. In any organization, you need one way or another to have some mechanism that makes decisions if the other mechanisms fail. So you might operate in a democratic mode. You might put to votes. There are lots of ways that any organization, any society can make its decisions. But in the end, sometimes those processes fail. And then you need some mechanism to deal with that. If you don't have that, you have paralysis or you have chaos. And Orpheus was always, no matter what else was going on, deeply dedicated to being quite sure that when the lights came down at 8 o'clock, the music was ready to be made on stage. And so the person who was in that role of the director, the CEO, if you will, of Orpheus, and that was me, becomes the decision maker of last resort on pretty much anything. So the question is, what do you do as a decision maker of last resort? How do you know that you're being successful in an organization like Orpheus? And of course, I was asking myself this question because I was coming to Orpheus as a recovering conductor, somebody who was used to the old school way of doing things.
A middleman, as you just said.
Yeah, exactly. So it became really clear to me pretty quickly that there was a simple way of putting it. As the decision maker of last resort, I can gauge my effectiveness as the CEO of Orpheus in inverse proportion to the number of decisions that I was making. If I didn't have to make a lot of decisions, if other people were making decisions that I was quite satisfied and happy with, that because they were probably more knowledgeable about those things than me, better positioned to make those decisions in many cases, then I was doing my job well, because I was fostering and developing and safeguarding a culture and a process that supported those things. And on those occasions where I had to step in and make a decision, I would do it. But in a sense, I always viewed those as a little bit of a failure of something in the system, which would lead me to think about, okay, so how can we do this differently in the future? So that's not really necessary.
Mm. Oh, that's a very interesting part, because this means the way of working, let's say, extended from the music and the score to the organization where there might be no score.
Right.
So, and I think that's a very strong link to put together, and where you had one person that was, let's say, responsible to keep it all together. And also maybe just to make one link about the conductor as middleman, that's often when
when there's, let's say, a high-level talk about leadership with the conductor as a leader, it's always like actually he's the first follower of the composer, meaning if you have an orchestra of conductors, as you just said, this means the orchestra of conductors is looking much more to what actually we're doing, meaning the score, and bringing this to life where a person had a creative idea and also the skills to bring it down to paper so that other people as some kind of instruction can bring it to great music.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this because listening is one of the top leadership skills, and I feel honored about this. It is my mission to find, create, and share inspirations for meaningful collaboration based on music analogies. If you want to support this, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, or write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And more inspirations can be found on musicthinking.com. We have a blog, and you can download the Music Thinking Framework. And finally, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you need help with a business challenge, please reach out to me via email, podcast@musicthinking.com.